Good evening. I'm Ann Marie Lipinski. I'm the curator of Harvard's Nieman Foundation for Journalism. It is my great privilege to welcome you all to the Walter Lippmann House for this important town hall discussion, Journalism and the Boston Marathon Bombings, Timing, Trust, and Credibility in the Age of Twitter. We have a full house here this evening, and I hope an even greater number following online with us tonight. 75 years ago, when Agnes Wall Nieman gave Harvard the gift that would fund the creation of the Nieman Foundation, she proclaimed her interest thusly: to promote and elevate the standards of journalism in the United States and educate persons deemed specially qualified for journalism. The sentiment was elegant and clear, and for many decades, newspaper men and women were the beneficiaries of her largesse and a shared notion of what journalistic standards were and who was qualified to uphold them. 7.5 decades later, Mrs. Nieman's wish looms for me as less elegant edict and more of an obstacle course, one that comes with important rewards if we succeed, and we must, but that is marked with steep cliffs and blind alleys. What do we mean when we say standards of journalism? And who among us would we appoint to determine who among us is, quote, specially qualified for journalism? This was brought home in recent weeks in spectacular fashion. The tragedy that began with the fatal concussive blasts near the finish line of the Boston Marathon on April 15th taxed a region's medical and law enforcement communities, its citizenry, its very soul. But it also challenged the journalism community, giving rise to coverage that was deep, nuanced, and precise, at the same time that it humbled the mighty and upstart alike with familiar temptations: the once impeccable source, an open microphone, the tip that seems too good to be true and is. But there are new temptations in the age of social media, not least of all the simple and momentarily satisfying retweet. We witness the trusted crowd as a source of great power and good, just as we saw a manhunt morph into a witch hunt. The increasing ease of communicating a fact-free claim: 12 dead, likely suspects, a suspect about to be arrested. Politicians ask a clarifying question: are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? What would we answer if the measurement were journalism, or more broadly, access to accurate information in a republic? By many measures, this is as exhilarating an era as journalism has ever known. But the complications loom large, and the path to answering in the affirmative, yes, we are better off, is not yet lighted. At Nieman, we believe that careful examination of stories like the Boston Marathon have much to offer us, and so have organized tonight's discussion around a number of people who played key roles in our understanding of the unfolding story. I'll start on my far right and introduce our participants tonight. First is David Beard, who joins us today from Washington, where he is Director of Digital Content for the Washington Post. He is a former digital editor and deputy editor-in-chief of the National Journal, as well as former editor of Boston.com. While at the Boston Globe, he served in a variety of roles, including assistant foreign editor and assistant managing editor overseeing suburban coverage. David was the voice of the Post's social media presence throughout the Boston bombing coverage. To his left is Cheryl Fiandaca. She is the Bureau Chief of Public Information for the Boston Police Department. Cheryl, who is an attorney, worked as a local television journalist in New York and Boston for more than a decade before joining the Boston PD, and covered stories such as the 9/11 attacks and the O.J. Simpson trial. Her tweets following the Boston Marathon bombings were among the most closely watched and reissued missives during the long week of breaking news, and really since then and on through today's. breaking stories. Seth Mnookin is co-director of MIT's graduate program in science writing and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. Seth grew up in Boston at the top of Heartbreak Hill, an infamous point along the marathon route just shy of the 21-mile mark. On the evening he received MIT's emergency alert text that shots had been fired on campus, he drove to the site of Officer Sean Collier's death and began following police, first to the site of the carjacking and then to Watertown, where the manhunt for the suspect ended. He tweeted updates of the story throughout the night and until 6 a.m. the following morning, an experience he documented for The New Yorker. Callie Crossley is host of WGBH's Under the Radar with Callie Crossley, a weekly examination of media in New England. Callie is also a former Nieman Fellow and a program manager at the Nieman Foundation. She has served as host and executive producer of The Callie Crossley Show and has appeared often on CNN's Reliable Sources, the PBS NewsHour, and locally on Beat the Press, analyzing press performance on significant stories. David Abel is a current Harvard Nieman Fellow and has been a Boston Globe writer since 1999. He has written extensively about Latin America, national security, higher education, poverty, and the environment. While studying as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard this year, David enrolled in a documentary filmmaking class. On the afternoon of the bombings, he was standing at the marathon finish line with a video camera, waiting for the subject of his documentary to complete her race. He was 10 yards from the first explosion. Jennifer Peter is one of David's editors at the Boston Globe. As deputy managing editor for news, Jen oversees the Globe's coverage of government, politics, education, crime, and daily life in Boston and the suburbs. Before becoming an editor, Jennifer spent 12 years as a reporter in Boston, Virginia, Connecticut, and Idaho. In the frantic hours and days following the attack, she helped coordinate the Globe's highly regarded coverage, helping to make sense of a massive and confusing array of reports. In addition to these six, we have a wealth of expertise in the room from Harvard, MIT, Boston, and beyond, representing the journalism, technology, government, and citizen spheres. We'll be hearing from many of them tonight. And moderating the discussion will be James Geary. James is the deputy curator of the Nieman Foundation, editor of Nieman Reports, and former Europe editor for Time magazine. A couple of house rules for those of you tweeting this evening. It's hashtag Nieman, that's Nieman. And we will be opening this up for questions a little later and would ask our guests here at Lippman House to please stand when you ask a question and to introduce yourselves so that people who are watching this live stream can hear you. And for those of you participating via live stream, you can send questions to us via Twitter at hashtag Nieman. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and please welcome James Geary.
Thank you, Ann Marie, and thank you all for coming this evening, and thank you to those who are joining us online. I'd like to begin, if I may, just by setting the scene, because as our main participants this evening, we have people who were present and covering every aspect of what happened just about 2 weeks ago. So we have reporters on the scene, we have editors in the newsroom, we have public officials, we have analysts and commentators. So I'd like to begin by starting with the reporters who were there, David and Seth. If you could just briefly tell us where you were, why you were there, what your first professional reaction was to what happened, and how your coverage ended up being different from any other breaking news story. And David, if we can start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much for hosting us and for that introduction, Ann Marie. So Ann Marie, I think, set the stage a little bit about where I was and why I was there. I'd like to say that I had never imagined I would experience something like this as a Nieman Fellow. The idea was to complete a documentary that I'd spent months working on, and I was waiting for the woman I was making the film about to cross the finish line. She was probably about 5 minutes out, and just to give a little backstory, some of my colleagues here who are Nieman Fellows have heard this a little bit, but I had started the day out with this young woman going to Hopkinton, where the marathon started, and then with Boston Globe colleagues got rides to Wellesley, and then they dropped me off at the finish line. And using their media credentials, I was able to get into the finish line area and was, in fact, escorted by a marathon official to the finish line. And the only reason they allowed me to do that was because I explained the story I was hoping to finish, and they were very gracious to allow me to do that. I probably arrived on the finish line about 2:35, 2:40, and I was taking video of all kinds of folks as they were coming in, and then the bombs went off, and I, at first, like a lot of folks, wasn't quite sure of what we were experiencing. This is, in fact, the video that I took. And after the first bomb exploded, there was a lot of smoke. Some of us thought perhaps it was some sort of machinery malfunction, gas explosion, maybe some sort of celebratory gunfire, and then it immediately became clear that something horrible had happened. And right in that sense, we realized we heard the second bomb, and immediately, like when the second plane hit the second tower at the World Trade Center, we knew that there was an attack. And for me, I just found myself in this position where I had this really fancy HD video camera from Harvard that I just pretty much learned how to use, and knew I was there to document the scene, and within minutes called my editors at the Boston Globe and recounted what I was witnessing, and we were posting line by line. It was sort of like almost the old days. It was like full stop. Let me post that sentence, and then I would recount another sentence of what I was witnessing. Full stop. That would be posted, and we went like that until we sort of completed a rough draft of the first story.
Seth, how about you?
Well, on the Monday of the marathon, my son and I were actually at Fenway, which is about, I think, almost exactly a mile from the finish line. And we left a little bit early because he is not a fan of sudden loud noises. And so we got home a little bit after 2. I put him to sleep, and then I got an email from my wife telling me about the bombing. So for that day, I was mostly at home. On Thursday, I was at home again, and just after 11 o'clock, I got an emergency alert from MIT, where I work, that shots had been fired on campus. And one of the, not irony, but a sort of oddity about this is one of my first jobs in journalism was as a night cops reporter, and the person who had the job immediately before me was David Abel. And so I started listening to the scanner, to a police scanner, and I could tell right away that this was not a situation where there was uncertainty about whether shots had actually been fired. There was a sort of false report of shots fired at MIT a couple of weeks earlier, and that this was also not a typical shooting, to the extent that there's a typical shooting. There was a lot of urgency, multiple departments responding. So I got my car and went down to MIT. By the time I got there, Sean Collier had been pronounced dead, and the police had set up a perimeter, and also from covering cops in the past, it seemed like that was going to be a situation where more and more reporters were going to arrive, and then in 4 hours we would be told that we'll have a statement for you in the morning. And since I actually wasn't on assignment, I didn't feel any compunction to stick around for that. And as I was getting ready to leave, about half a dozen state police and Boston police cars just tore down Main Street towards Central Square faster than I had ever seen a police car drive in an urban environment outside of right after 9/11. And so I followed them, and also was listening to the scanner as this was going on. So followed them to where where Danny, the carjacking victim, had escaped. And then while we were there were reports on the scanner of bombs and shots fired at officers in Watertown. Because I grew up playing video games in the Watertown Mall, I knew how to get to Watertown very quickly from where we were. And at one point, I picked up a college student in my car, who's the son of a friend of mine, who's a college journalist. And at one point, the cops veered off, and I think the person I was with was getting worried that I wasn't going the right direction. I was like, no, don't worry. I know where I'm going if we're going to Watertown. So we arrived a couple of blocks away from where the shootout was, 5 or 10 minutes after it had ended. And so we didn't know, and a lot of the police at the scene didn't know exactly what was going on at that point. Tamerlan had obviously been apprehended, but everyone knew there was another suspect at large. So we arrived there. I parked my car at the intersection where this manhunt was sort of starting. The police at the scene had been told to power down their cell phones. But I was using my cell phone. I hadn't realized that, and I think they realized that it was sort of futile because we were in the middle of this dense residential area. So they started asking me, how do you get to Laurel Street, and do you know what the next intersection is? So I was there really as the situation in Watertown unfolded for the next bunch of hours. My car ended up being stuck inside the perimeter with 2 large black backpacks sitting on the seats. And so I went and told the state police, a member of the state police, not to blow up my car in a controlled explosion. So I just was tweeting throughout the night. And I think probably because I had had some experience as a cops reporter, I was able to exercise some judgment in terms of what information I was putting out there and what information wasn't relevant and actually might be hurtful or harmful. I could, I at one point looked down on my phone, and at the beginning of the night I had 8,500 Twitter followers, and then it was 30,000, and then it was 40,000, and then it was 46,000. Obviously at some point between 1 and 4 a.m., somehow I was identified as a source for information there.
We can explain how that happened a little bit later.
What happened to the other 8,000 followers?
Well, so now, literally, every time I tweet, I can see like hundreds fall off. It's like, I need to think, like, is it worth it for me to say this? Because I'm going to lose another 500 followers.
It's not you.
Let's get an editor's perspective now. We have an editor for the local newspaper and then for a non-local newspaper. So, Jen, if you could tell us what you were doing, what was going through your mind at that moment.
Well, unlike David, I was far from the scene. I had actually told people that weekend, I took the day off, and a lot of people in Metro took the day off. It's vacation week. And I had said to people, Marathon Monday is not a very Metro day. We had a lot of sports presence out there. We go to Lexington Green. We might do some color from the finish line or along the route. But it's a day that after what had felt to us like a very busy couple of months with other things that now seem less significant, that it seemed like a good day to take the day off. So I was in Portsmouth with my husband, who's also a reporter at the paper, and our kids, and we'd had a nice day, and we'd actually sort of thought in a not very serious way, like, we loved it up there, and like, could we ever see leaving journalism? And then 3 o'clock comes, and the city editor, Steve Smith, gives me a call, and I'm literally like carrying a kid to the car, and I had to call him back, and he tells me what happened, and I utter something that my children shouldn't hear, and how bad is it, trying to get some sense, because we do sometimes have the things that sound bad at first, and this seemed obviously immediately evident. He said people are missing limbs, and it became immediately evident. This is a tragedy unfolding. So it was a very fast and also very long car trip back to Boston, as I was sort of already looking at the tweets and looking at what David was reporting into Boston.com, talking on the phone to editors and making sure we were in place. And I have to say, I don't think Metro, besides David, who was there for another purpose, I don't believe Metro had one reporter out at the finish line. And by the time I got back at about 4, we had 12 reporters at the finish line, and ultimately about 30 reporters on the story that day. And in the next 8 hours before the last edition went out, we produced 14 stories for the paper. And it was, I was thinking coming into this, I haven't had a lot of time to sort of feel like be introspective about what we've done and how we did it, and what made it different than any other event. But it was one thing that amazed me was that even at the Globe, sometimes we can be our separate departments, and sports does its thing, and Metro does its thing, and we can be competitive sometimes. And I've never seen an entire staff so focused on one event. And we were talking that day, there's some stories that we're going to go on the Metro front, and almost putting anything out there seemed somehow disrespectful or just odd. Like, how could we write about, a new commuter line going in? It just seemed irrelevant to sort of what was breaking around us. And then I was also in the newsroom on Thursday night into Friday, following Seth and many others out at the Watertown site, and I had just finished up the main bar for Friday's paper. It's one of those stories that we labored over, and then 2 hours later we're completely ripping up. And was just about to go home. We hear about the shooting, and I'm sort of hoping I can slip away, but think it would be bad form in case it's something I shouldn't leave. And obviously, things, it was sounding crazier and crazier, and then we were able to confirm it was connected to the bombings, and again, sort of had an army of people out there, and it was amazing to see our staff, David among them, mobilize, and in the middle of the night into a potentially very dangerous situation, and I think everyone out there did a really remarkable job.
And the view from Washington, David?
I was farther than Portsmouth away. But, I was chatting, sort of direct messaging and listening to a live cast of Shri Srinivasan's live stream of what would be, in 15 minutes, the Pulitzer Prize that he's joking around with, just old stories and various. I think this is kind of work, and then I see something pop up at the same time. Vernon Loeb, our Metropolitan editor, who had completed the marathon, sent an urgent note to Marty Barron, who used to be editor in Boston, is now in Washington. And we got this kind of shadow group. We had to present this other group that would gather for Phil Kendicott's presentation of his Pulitzer for architectural thing. But alongside that, you saw the whole newsroom sort of running around, getting things together, making sure we built Twitter lists quickly with DPD or Cheryl's work, and other things that we could cover. I talked to 2 former colleagues, Benny DiNardo and then Caleb Solomon, about using first Steve Silva's photo and video and David Ryan's photo. It wasn't until later I saw John Tulmaki's photo, just so that we could illustrate what had happened on our pages with full credit. And just to get that, I think after the sort of Pulitzer ceremony, there wasn't a lot of champagne drunk in Washington Post newsroom, or many others that day, but I'd sort of kind of explained where we were to Marty, and we had Mary Beth Sheridan, who's with us and is a fellow, and Alex is a fellow, 2 from our staff, and we had David Montgomery, another reporter who also finished the marathon before the bombing and was reporting full throttle afterward. Vernon got to his car before they closed the Prudential Center parking lot, but he did forget his charger for his iPhone, which became a problem. But anyway, so we mobilized from afar and tried to kind of do the right sort of sourcing so I could say, no, I trust him, no, I don't. Now, if it's 2:30 a.m. Friday, and I see a tweet from Jennifer Peter about a police source and somebody who'd been in custody, I'm going to probably retweet that. Take that to the bank. So we had to figure out who was sort of pretending, who didn't know, and who did, and where we could go so that we didn't make any quick mistakes, and where we could get basic facts. And sometimes it went from institutional sources outward, but we can get into that more later.
Let's hear from an institutional source now. Cheryl, you have a unique perspective on this because you're a former television journalist,
Right.
and you're in charge of public information for the Boston Police Department, and took a very active tweeting role. So tell us what were your instincts at that moment when the news was breaking?
Well, when the news was breaking, I was shopping with my 17-year-old niece, and we were buying things that someone that's 17 wants to buy. And I started seeing that my phone, I was getting all these calls, but they kept dropping out as soon as I would pick them up. So I couldn't get any calls. And finally, I got one call through. It was one of my other nieces, and she said, "Where's Auntie Gina? There's been bombs at the marathon." And I'm like, what? My sister was running the marathon, and we were tracking her, so she was right about to come in. She was about 8 minutes out when the bombs hit. And so we got outside, I got a phone signal and called the commissioner, and he said, we've got to let people know to get away from the area, just start doing whatever you need to do to let people know that they need to clear the area. So I had to drive, so I said to my niece, start tweeting. I said, tell people that they need to get away from the area. So I'm telling her what to tweet, and she's tweeting it as we're driving.
From your account?
From my account, right.
She's BPD?
She's BPD. She is.
Our
And
primary source here is a 17-year-old.
17-year-old, and she just stayed totally calm. She was terrific the whole way. And, I said, call your dad, tell him to pick you up. So we rendezvoused, and I went into Boston. And what was amazing is, we all rallied at the Westin, and every agency was there, and they were trying to make plans about what we needed to do, and a news conference. And in the meantime, all this information was coming in, so I was tweeting it out, because so many people just didn't know what was happening. They didn't know whether this was an attack, it wasn't an attack, whether this was something, a sewer explosion. No one had any idea what was going on. So we tried to be as mindful as we could and as transparent as we could to get the facts out. And for me, it was just instinct. I mean, I'm a reporter, and I just thought, I have to report. I have to report the facts and let people know what's happening. And that's sort of the genesis of how the tweeting started. I had no idea that the tweeting would become as big as it did. And I think what we learned is that we already had the infrastructure in place, and I inherited all that, so it's none of my doing. And so we were already using Twitter to break news. And we were already doing that, and people were already following us, realizing that we were going to let you know something before newspapers or TV or anybody else. So that had already been in place. We already had a pretty active Twitter account. When I got there, we were at 16,000. When after a few months, we were at 54,000. One day into this, we went from 54,000 to over 100,000. We're now at 333,000 followers on Twitter. And it just really showed how we went from a very reliable, transparent, accurate, timely source. And it was a direct source. So people didn't have to wonder, is this information true or not? They knew that if we were tweeting it, it was true. So I think in that way, it was kind of a watershed moment for a lot of people that we were actually following reports during the week when people said we had a suspect, and we were watching the reports, and then finally I said, we have to do something about this. This is crazy. So we tweeted out, we have no suspect in custody. And that got retweeted, thousands of times. And we didn't really need to say that someone made a mistake or that the information was wrong. We just need to say what the information was that was right. So I think in that way, that's what we were doing. And as the week progressed, we put the pictures of the suspects out. And then on the night of when the MIT officer was shot, it was, 10:30, 11 o'clock, my office called. I had just had dinner with a friend, and they said, an officer shot. It's these guys were on a chase. They just hijacked a car. And I thought, oh, my God. And I picked up 2 of the officers that work in my office, and we headed out to Watertown. And we're driving out there, and the 2 of the officers I picked up are females, and I have a rule in my office, no one can be taller than I am. So they're small. And we drive into Watertown, and we see these 2 kids on bicycles, and they are kind of around that age, so the 2 of them jump out of the car, they grab these 2 kids, they throw them on the ground. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is crazy. Where am I? What have I done to myself? And, we find out that these kids are just kids that thought they was all the action, they wanted to go see what was going on, crazy. And so then we're driving through all these back streets of Watertown, and it's really dark. And there are police everywhere, and they're all heavily armed, and they're tanks, as we call them. The bear they're all over the streets. It's crazy. It's like a scene out of a movie. And we pull up to one location where operations told me the commissioner would be, and they were trying to set up a command post. And we get there, and I'm thinking, wow, this is a crazy place to set up a command post. It's pitch dark, and there's all these people, and there's a tank. So I said to the officer there, I'm looking for the commissioner. And he says, well, he's not here because this is where the bombs are. And I thought, oh my God, I don't want to be anywhere where there are bombs. So we left there, and then we realized that we're all going to rendezvous over by the Arsenal Mall, and that's where we went at that point. And at that point, everybody had to get together to determine what we were going to do and what information needed to be put out. And as the hour was getting late, we knew that we needed to get the other picture of the suspect out. At that point, we had some information that they had robbed a 7-Eleven, which turned out not to be true, but that's kind of where the carjacking took place. And it was the story was really convoluted. But I think we just tried to get out the basic facts that we knew so that people knew what was happening. Because again, at this point, everyone is glued to television and everywhere else trying to get information. Once we kind of realized that one suspect was dead, we had an officer that was very seriously injured, and the other suspect on the loose, then the real question became a public safety issue. And that's when we were telling people in that immediate area to stay inside and to lock their doors and to not open them. And then it became that the hour was getting late, and we had to make a decision about what we were going to do next in terms of letting people know, could they go to work, could they not go to work? And it was really, that's the moment where you had all these agencies had to come together and make a determination as to what to do and what people needed to know. And that's when they shut down, the subway system. And then we had a report that we found another bomb, and some people were stopped, and there were suspects in custody, and there were no suspects in custody on that incident. And then a train gets stopped on its way to New York because the people in the taxi let somebody off at South Station. And so then they thought the bombs were on their way on a train. I mean, you couldn't even make up this story. But at the end of the day, I think the one thing that was, fascinating in the fact that it seemed like this was an episode of 24. Everything happened in one day. From the time the bombs went off to the time that, we captured the last suspect in a boat, which is, really bizarre. So I think during that whole time, you had to get all these agencies to get together and work together, which doesn't usually happen because everybody's, got an ego and everybody wants to be in charge of the investigation. But at this point, we're not in Boston anymore. We're in Watertown, and we still want to be in charge. So, and people let the commissioner be in charge. It was really remarkable with the state police, with the FBI, and they all just worked together and said, okay, we've got to worry about public safety, number one, right now, and we've got to shut down the transit system, and we've got to tell people to stay inside, and we have to do this grid search, and we're in the bunker, and they're putting out maps on the table and determining where the perimeters are going to be and how many teams and who the teams are going to be made up of. I thought we were in Afghanistan. We're looking at maps, and they're doing a grid search. And it was just really incredible. And these guys were so tired, and everybody had been working nonstop, including everyone in my office who I didn't have to call anybody to come to work, including the unpaid intern who came in on her own. Everybody was just so focused on finding the people believed to be responsible for this. So sleep didn't matter, nothing mattered. This job had to get done. And so these guys were out there throughout the night, throughout the whole next day, just searching, really, in every house, in every garage, in every backyard, looking for this last suspect. And at one point, they had called it quits because it looked like this was just not happening and that he had somehow escaped the area. And that's what the thought was at that point. And right after the news conference, I left to go home. I got almost home, and I'm listening to because I have a radio in my car, and I was listening to it, and I'm thinking, oh my God, they're screaming shots were fired, and I thought, no good's gonna come of this. And turned around, went back, and listened, it was sort of like maybe, I don't know, maybe in the old days when you sat around the radio and you listened to like a radio show and it was so dramatic. And it was so dramatic because you were listening to what they were saying about having all the officers get away from the back of the boat. You were worried whether or not he had a gun or had bombs. In the midst of all this, my nephew is on the Metro North SWAT team, and he was the team that was assigned and he was at the boat. So my family's calling me saying, oh my God, what's going on? Does he have bombs? I mean, we had no idea if he had bombs, if he had guns, or he had anything. So it was just such a dramatic moment leading up to the capture, which was kind of anticlimactic because he was so badly injured that they were able to just take him into custody. But up until then, there was just such emotion everywhere. I mean, everyone was worried about somebody and their family, or just the fear itself of what could have happened. So it was, being a part of it was just remarkable on so many levels, but not realizing that Twitter and what we were doing on Twitter was really going to play such a major role. As I've said to everybody, they asked me the difference between being a reporter and this job. And I said, well, being a reporter, you have responsibilities. Like there are things that you have to do. This job, you are responsible. And so for me, that meant that we couldn't make any mistakes and we couldn't put out any information that we weren't 100% sure of. And that was a really tough balance because, as everybody knows that's ever covered a news story, it's breaking news and it's developing, and what you think is true right this minute might not be true 10 minutes from now. So it was a really tough balance, and I wasn't the only one tweeting. We had the other officers in my unit were tweeting, and none of us made a mistake, which was really incredible when I think back on it. But they all have really great judgment and are really trustworthy. So it was great to see that we were able to play such a major role, even though we weren't out on the street catching the bad guys. We were helping deliver information in a timely, accurate, and resourceful way for people, that they could get the information directly from us. And in that way, it was really satisfying.
Right,
So that's
you
it.
did make a mistake.
I did?
The milkman was from Brookline.
Oh, that's true. But that was way after.
Okay.
I don't count that.
Callie, can you give us your perspective as someone with deep experience in the local area, who's also an experienced analyst and commentator? How are you making sense of all this?
Well, I'm happy to say that in the old days and the new days, radio was very active. I think this is on. Was very active during this time. In fact, I was on my way from WGBH here to work on the afternoon of the bombing, and for whatever reason didn't have the radio on at the moment because I just come from it being on. And I got here and found out the bombing had taken place, and my first thought was about a colleague who was at the finish line, who was there to report the finish line. So I'm texting him like crazy, and he's not answering. And finally I answered and said, I'm completely freaked out, and yes, I'm here, and I'm okay, and blah, blah, blah. So we had to make a determination about what we're going to do because our local show had gone off the air, and we decided to go back on the air live. Now, in a situation like this, when you're a local affiliate of public media, you can make a determination to go live as we did, or to take NPR, the national. But as I think we'll see in this conversation, it became more important to deal with people who really knew what was happening here. So our job as a community radio program offering information for everybody is really to assess and coalesce all of the information that's been shared here and to repeat it constantly in a way that's not annoying to people, but also if you are going up and down the dial, which many people were, to be able to hit the dial and say, we have just learned What we know is, here's the phone number, here's not the phone number, no, it is not true, all of that. And to leave the lines open for folks so they could call in and ask questions, which they did do. And we also took calls from people who were on the scene, our reporters, and also other people who were in charge in various locations as they had time, because it was fast moving. And we were on the air until 11 o'clock that night. They kept, if you recall, they kept pushing the press conference back, that last one, and we just decided to wait it out and be on the air for that, to be able to answer questions and also interpret whatever was said for that day. So that was Monday. And the rest of the week we went long, added an hour or two to each of our normal 2-hour middle of the day broadcasts, again doing the same kind of thing, but now with a more concentrated effort of getting people who were very specific to their involvement to the case, particularly of voices of authority. And also beginning to discuss some of the issues that people had about, well, I don't understand, they said this yesterday, what about this? I was frankly surprised at how many people just had basic questions that they wanted answered. And they felt a need to be able to connect to someone like us, where they felt that they could trust and to give them credible information. So that was really important. Thursday, I go out to dinner with a friend of mine in Area 4, which is 2 blocks over from the shooting. We get out at 10:30. I know nothing about this, and just by a quirk, I went the other way, because it literally was happening at the same time that we got out. And I get home, the next morning, she's like, oh my God, we were right there. So that was pretty amazing. But by the time I found out what was happening, because I turned my phone off that night, I was so tired this week, I didn't know about the shootout in Watertown until the early morning. And by that time, decisions had to be made about what staff stayed in the station and what staff did not come in for safety's sake. So I became NPR's favorite shut-in. That's my statement. I kept calling me, and I kept talking about what I saw, what the sense was, all of that. And it was, again, very important as part of the whole information. So I really wore 2 hats. I was a part of being able to participate to give information to our community. And at the same time, because I'm monitoring all of this stuff, I have a good sense of what local did particularly. I think they did fine. We can talk about it more, but I really had a chance to really revisit and review what was happening both locally and nationally.
I'd like to talk about not just Twitter, but social media in general as a reporting tool, because in many respects, this was the oldest fashioned kind of journalism there is, and calling into the newsroom and dictating the story over the phone. It's, one of the oldest forms of reporting. But at the same time, in a way, the world was your newsroom. And I'm just wondering, from an editorial perspective, if we could start there, where do you begin to sort through that information? And how do you determine which sources you're going to follow and which sources you're going to ignore? And how do you determine how you're going to deploy the reporting resources, the professional reporting resources that you do have based on that information? Jen?
That's a lot of questions in there. We have at the Globe, I think it was really with the Sal DeMacy trial and then the Whitey Bulger capture, we embraced social media a long time ago, and I think by the time, by Marathon Monday, we were, it was second nature to a lot of reporters, and we have equipped most reporters in the field with iPhones where you can take pictures and take video and tweet. And, I sometimes can't believe that that's what my job has come down to. But a lot of, we want to get the big stories, we want to get the enterprise, but I'm always reminding people, I think David can attest, tweet from that court case or tweet, when you're out there, let us know. It's a very easy way for us to let our online, that we have 2 reporters who are dedicated to sort of online reporting in the room, and they will take feeds right from people's, Twitter accounts. I mean, for us, we were able to get a lot of people out, at the Marathon site, at the hospitals, at the Common. We still have, enough reporters and very good reporters that we could really fan them across the city, and that's a lot of what I was watching on Twitter. And then, obviously, if BPD tweets, we can take that to the bank. Then there's, what we were seeing will come back to me in nightmares, I'm sure. A lot of the other news organizations coming in, the national news organizations tweeting out an aspect of this that, we didn't know about yet. And then there's, can we verify this? Have we heard this? And going back to our reporters with the deepest sources and seeing if there's anything to this. And I think there's been a lot of attention put on when news organizations got things wrong, and there's some sense, I know that I saw on Twitter, some people thinking we're cavalier in what we put out there, and I'm sure I speak for other news organizations around the country and represented here, a ton of thought went into, to what we report. I mean, there wasn't this, oh, well, CNN's reporting, we're just going to throw it up there. There's an amazing amount of discussion, an amazing amount of phone calls going around to reporters in the room and saying, can you talk to your people? Can you figure out, can we get two sources on this? And it doesn't always lead to perfection, but there's a lot of discussion, and I think some people would be amazed to see how much thought does go into this, into what we retweet.
James, if I could add, I mean, we had basic language issues. For the first 5 hours or so, it was like blast or explosion, but not bomb quite yet. I think it was not until BPD said bomb could we could kind of go and say this is a bomb. But we want to be very, very cautious. Likewise, if I could have done one thing from this, I kind of wished, in a way, I was at my old paper, because I leaned on the Globe a bit to kind of do a roundup of all the hospitals to get a better accounting as the numbers of wounded went from like 17 to 27 to 51 to 70 to 82 to 103 to 150 to 178 or whatever, and now over 200. And so all we needed was, that sounds easy to say, nobody's going to give you the information, but you have a list of the hospitals and you just add it up. And this is the count from the hospitals at that time. So, and then degree of things. I think there was a sort of an over-reporting of possibility of amputations in the beginning. There was like sometimes I would even lean, like maybe it was an official tweet about, no, the 7-Eleven wasn't connected, and I could say report that with certainty, but there was that weird quirk that they were in the store at the same time and got caught on the video that nobody could have really. It just sort of, there are things that were just jumps of logic, in this coverage too. This is our grid. We basically put together, is it okay? A way in which we could kind of do, like Susan Tran in Watertown, you could see certain TV reporters or others who just said what they knew. They didn't kind of over surmise. And so when I saw that, we were using like a geolocator for people with Watertown slugs that day, or same with Instagrams. And I would just, if you're in this, all I have to do is favorite something from those two things and they'll roll in here. Or if it's a photo that's been cleared by our photo staff, that makes it as well. But I could say, no, this is somebody like doing a fake photo, or this is, and I really erred on the side of not being, of not going out there. I didn't even have LA Times might have reported. Maybe I didn't read it from the Globe about the Shell station a day earlier, and it sounded like a great story, but I just didn't have it. And I thought, I've been there. They have crummy snacks. What do you mean snacks? And I didn't know where he ran to, and the guy was armed. So it wasn't until I saw the charging papers documents, which were masterfully written, by the way, the next day, that we could really dive in and grab all the stuff that wasn't done and get it out very quickly. And we really leaned on documents as much as we could. And David and Jen's colleague, Jason Tui, who runs BostonGlobe.com, told me to say that the Twitter video thing, Vine, also using that in a geolocated way, was very important in this in covering this too. A lot of these very short videos.
Could I underscore the language, because that is very important? There's no early hours in those 6 hours or so sitting on the radio hosting that. We really worked not to say bombing until somebody, like Cheryl, said it was a bombing. Because that became incredibly important. And to stay away from terrorists, because that's not language that was appropriate to say at the time. So I think, in an ever-evolving situation, even when it looks as bad as it did, it's important to know that you have to have some restraint in that way.
And Seth and David, how was it for you? Because you guys were out there reporting, tweeting, and presumably also relying on Twitter for reporting leads from other journalists and non-professional journalists. So how did you work with that equation of when to tweet and not to tweet, when to report?
Well, I oftentimes do use Twitter as a reporting tool. I find it's a really effective, powerful way to find sources and to reach people who you otherwise couldn't reach. For this story, certainly Thursday night and Friday morning, I wasn't using it in that way. I was really just focused on what was happening in front of me and trying to parse through that. There were some times where I tried to add some clarity to other reports that I saw out there. So at some point around 3, sometime between 3 or 4 in the morning, when the Boston State Police PIO, who was there, came over and first I think at 2:30 said there were 2 suspects in custody. Then at 3 came back and said, no, there's only 1 suspect in custody and 1 still at large. And so when I put that out, I saw that the Globe had also just said that there was confirmation that they were connected to the marathon. And all I could say was that he had said at that point, the State Police PIO had said that he couldn't confirm that at that time. So my first thought was, okay, well, I should put that out there, not confirming that it's related to the marathon bombings. But then that isn't, I was worried that that would give a slightly false impression because it would make it seem like I was saying that that's not true. And so I forget exactly what I said, but I tried to make clear that the Globe has this information. This is what they said. So this is out there. Here's someone at the middle of a very chaotic, evolving scene who just had to revise whether they had 2 or 1 suspect in custody. He's not confirming that yet. That doesn't mean it's not happening. It's not true. It just means that that's what we're dealing with this type of scene on the ground. So.
Sure. I had a few, I'd say, novel experiences with Twitter over this past few weeks. The first was having the tables sort of turned on me, where instead of becoming the reporter, I became the subject, because in some ways I was suddenly a participant in this event. And what happened was, once there was a few minutes where I could put the camera down, I put out my first tweet, and that tweet seemed to go viral, I guess. And I suddenly, as I'm trying to report the story, I'm getting calls from Brian Williams and George Stephanopoulos and BBC, New Zealand radio. All of these people somehow saw my tweet and then somehow found a phone number for me online and were calling me directly, or somehow they were calling my parents. They were doing stuff that I would normally do, calling my mom, my sister, not my niece, but I should hire her out to tweet for me. And another novel experience, although I've done this before, I was helping write the story about the death of Sean Collier, and I basically was tweeting repeatedly throughout the day when I had a chance to interview the roommate who lived with the police officer, and I was the guy on the ground doing the reporting there. And basically, the story that was written was shaped through my tweets. So it was sort of a vehicle as opposed to just sending an email or a feed or having a phone conversation, which of course we did to gel certain things together. This was the vehicle for my colleague who was in the newsroom, who was putting everything together. She was able to rely on the tweets, I guess Twitter just became also a kind of overwhelming experience at some points. It's dizzying. It's like it's like 24-hour cable, but like it never stops. Like there are no slow moments in some ways, and I found that to be sometimes I just had to turn it off.
Just one quick thing I want to add is one thing that was definitely new for me in terms of how I interacted with Twitter is that night I was very consciously thinking that whenever I take notes at a scene like that, I can't read them. And so my tweets were going to be my notes if I was then going to write about it. And as soon as I had that realization that all of these are going to be time-stamped, they're going to reflect exactly what's going on, this is going to be better than what I would capture in a notebook, it sort of added an extra level of precision to what I was doing, because I was not aware at all as this was happening that all of these followers had found me. So I wasn't thinking like, okay, I'm a prime news source here. I was really thinking like, okay, I need to make sure this is right, because this is what I'm going to use as notes for if and when I ever do something like this.
Well,
if I could, I liked, like in the middle of this incessant thing of Twitter, occasionally you would say, they're asking me what I see now, and I'm looking at my kid, or something like that.
Right,
I'm
right.
back at home.
Right.
Or I don't know if you saw it on the grid, Delia Cave, who's a blogger here, basically said that, Friday night they've lifted the what would stay in place?
Shelter in place.
Shelter in place order, as if I'm going anywhere.
Right.
So that was just a kind of to show, something really. We shut down a major city for the first time. I also wanted to get that sociological implication out there in any way that I could.
I'll just also add that for me, Twitter became an outlet that I don't necessarily normally have as a reporter, where I'm writing in the third person, where I was so intimately connected to the events. It allowed me to write in a personal way and sort of vent and connect with, I think, a growing number of people about what I experienced and how it affected me and what I was seeing.
Well, speaking of Twitter, could I borrow the microphone? We have a question that came in via Twitter, and it's how do you rate the accuracy and reliability of sources on Twitter, and how do you use it during breaking news? And that's actually a nice introduction to some demos, tech demos, that we'd like to share with you this evening. And the first one is by Todd Mustak, who's from MIT, and he also works with the Institute of Quantitative Social Studies here at Harvard. And he's going to show some Twitter geocoded tracking software that he's developed. And for the first video that he's going to show, I just want to say up front that these are the geocoded tweets of Taylor Dobbs, who was in the car with Seth the night of the Watertown manhunt. And all the data you're going to see in a minute is all publicly available. And so you could get it if you wanted it, but we got Taylor's permission to use his location for this demo.
I'm too paranoid to allow geocoding of my
Seth
tweets,
said no.
so.
He'd be here in person.
No, I would give you guys permission, but I don't have it turned on my account.
So, so I've been working for the last year building this database. I call it MapD, Massively Parallel Database. I'd like to think it's the fastest database in the world, but somebody could prove me wrong. Anyways, one use case it's really good for is tracking tweets, and it maps them. So I pull in about 7 million geocoded tweets every day. Anytime you tweet on your cell phone with GPS enabled, it's probably being pulled into my database, for better or worse. And so one thing, I built this interface where you can, so there's like 100 million tweets on this, 58 million on that map right there. But so this is all being queried in real time. So say we wanted to search for a marathon. So you can see this is the percentage of tweets about marathon. So looking over the US, it peaked at about 2.5% right at the time of the bombing, right? So one interesting thing is that we can map this. So let's just play this. So you can see right when the news hits about this, the connection's a little slow. Wow. So you can see the news spread.
South Dakota and Montana were not
So Wi-Fi outage there.
That's one interesting thing. So,
and just Todd, quickly, what was the time scale from Boston going all red to the rest of the country going red? Was that a matter of seconds, minutes?
I think a few minutes. Like maybe we could look at it again, but probably 5 or 10 minutes. So Boston, certainly, there was a lot of local. It's very interesting from a sociological point of view, right? Because the news spreads locally, or maybe people even outside of Boston are calling into Boston. So these people find out first, and then it radiates outwards. So one thing I wanted, as James was saying, I wanted to look. This connection is incredibly slow. It's actually. It's normally faster than this.
If we were at
That's what they
MIT,
all
we
say.
would be smoking.
That's probably true.
So we were going to look at Taylor Dobbs' tweets, who I think was with you, Seth,
Right.
that night. So basically, we'll track you. Let's see. Do we get any? Did I spell his? Oh, because his tweets are. We want to look at the 19th, I think. There's. Let's make these points bigger. So
each dot represents one of Taylor Dobbs' tweets,
yeah,
the physical location of his tweet.
So we can actually see him. Actually, let me just show. Let me show the video, which I think is a little bit. I framed it a little bit better. Can we? So you can see him move around to MIT and then over into Watertown for the, which is pretty interesting. So if we. Where did that? There we go. So we can, interestingly, we can click on these and we can see. It's a good way to like. Journalist Party, don't stop. Okay, never mind. Let's look at. Oh, I did tweet text like Taylor Dobbs. Sorry that we want sender name. I don't know what. Okay, that's why we have the video. Oh, I have to do case insensitive. There we go. All right, so we can see what he said. Let's go around to MIT. We can see. So, State Police on the move, K9 unit. We can click here. Look at this photo. So you can do this for any. I mean, it's pretty interesting because if we take him off, we can actually just look for what happened, say, around Watertown. It's a great way to like explore. So where was, I believe right around here.
It's like Dexter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. That thing is ready to pounce. Not sure what that means. So anyways.
Thank you, Todd. What's fascinating about, some of the things that are fascinating about this is you can see how quickly the news spread on Twitter and how a newsroom could use this to track specific people, to potentially... I'm having a wardrobe malfunction here. To track specific people to potentially verify that what they're tweeting about, they're actually in a physical location that they could actually see. But also, the speed with which those tweets went out, there's no human being can possibly control that or curate that in real time, which is why our next demo is by Hong Q, who's a visiting fellow here at the Nieman Foundation, and he's working on a software program called Keeper, which is an automated system to identify credible sources in real time from live Twitter streams. And during the night of the manhunt, Hong was wide awake and, along with me, tracking what was going on and compiling a list of reliable sources, and that's how we found Seth Mnookin. So Hong can describe a little bit about his technology.
Great, thank you. First, I'd like to thank Ann Marie and Stephanie for inviting me to do a visiting Nieman Fellowship. I proposed the idea of trying to make sense of Twitter through an algorithm to automate and data mine the meaningful tweets out of all the millions and billions of tweets. and they actually believe I could do it. So that's why I'm here. So this is the tool that actually that's live and open source and to the public, keeper.com. The way I used it that night was I really wanted to know what's going on. I watched the live TV, but on TV they repeated the same piece of information. It wasn't really interesting. And so this tool is really trying to find what are the trending keywords or topics people are saying, who are the most reliable sources. And to do that in an algorithm is very ambitious, to try to find reliability and credibility of sources. So I'll let you play with this tool on your own, but the end result was I was able to compile this Twitter list of 20 on-the-scene reporters in about 5-10 minutes using my software. And the way I did it was just to show you some screenshots of how I did it. In screen one, you'll see that I typed in the search term suspects in Watertown, and the discussion that came out was about police radios. And one person asked, what exactly is a police radio and how do you use it? And so I found that wasn't really interesting. So I didn't follow that line.
Yeah.
One person is saying, who or what are scanners? What does it mean? You notice on the top left, it says Seth Mnookin. And that was kind of my way in to how to be able to follow scene by scene what's going on. And on the third screenshot, basically, I read Seth's tweets, and on the very bottom, he's saying, Taylor Dobbs and Brian DiManco and I are the only reporters. So I follow them, by the way. So that's how I was able to be able to verify who's on the scene and follow them and create a list just to tune into these people. And the software helped me kind of isolate and be able to quickly compile that list. And I'll be free later on to talk about the software.
So another thing that Hong's software turned up was local reporters and local journalists. And I think another interesting aspect to the way this story was covered was the role of local journalists, people with deep reporting experience and sources on the ground. And Dana Forsyth is the editor of Watertown Tab, and he was also tweeting in the night, and Hong's software turned his Twitter account up, and he's here, and I just want to ask him how he deployed his resources and how he compares the coverage that he was able to do as a hyper-local reporter to what was going on at the other levels of the news ecosystem. If you mind just standing up so everybody can have a look.
How you doing? We had actually a couple of different resources. I got the call from two stringers around, I want to say 12:30. They had heard some police chatter on the scanners. One of our reporters, Adam Sennett, actually lives in Watertown, and another stringer we have, Garrett Quinn, was pretty active on the scene. So I was getting information from them via phone, via Twitter. We also had WCVB as a partner of ours, so that was another kind of influx of information. And actually, most of the people we follow on Twitter as the Watertown Tab are residents. So we had this kind of unique perspective of seeing these tweets from local people flash on the screen. Some were geocoded. I was able to kind of get in touch with a few people in between just to verify, where they were, what they'd seen. In some instances, just retweeting pictures they'd taken, out their window. Andrew here, who you'll meet later, was one of those people early on. And it was just it was kind of an overload. There was just so much information coming through, and trying to balance, putting out a story and maintaining a kind of credible timeline of these events as, they were coming in was, it was just overwhelming. But our resources, they really kicked in the morning around 6 or 7 when we had other local people actually waking up and kind of finding out what was going on. So we had a few more reporters in the morning to kind of flesh things out.
One other aspect of the whole reporting phenomenon that I want to bring in before I open it up to questions, so if you have questions, please stand by, is the role of just ordinary citizens who happen to be in the wrong place at the right time with a smartphone. And Andrew Kitzenberg is one of those people, and he was, well, he lived across the street from the initial shootout on the 19th, and he's the person who took the pictures that probably many of you have seen of the actual shootout. So, Andrew, if you could just tell us what happened and what you were thinking, and if you, in retrospect, think you were thinking like a journalist or like a citizen or like some combination of both or neither.
I guess the obvious thing here that I'm one of the few people who doesn't have a pen and paper, so obviously I'm not a journalist. And actually I have no experience in journalism, in media, anything like that. And so
I just like you saying that at Nieman House.
I'd like to make that clear. Just, I guess, ease the pressure off of me a little bit. But at the time, I really, wasn't thinking as a journalist. I really wasn't thinking a whole lot. I would say I was probably in just a lot of shock, and there was a lot of adrenaline because why I really still can't explain what compelled me to go to the window and take photos during this whole ordeal. I was in the house with my 3 other roommates and all of us, and took cover.
So you were thinking like a journalist.
Maybe. Sure. Yeah, maybe knee-jerk reaction and a lot of curiosity to try to document what was going on. But while I was trying to take pictures and ultimately document, I wasn't thinking like a journalist to try to give my opinion. It was more so just explaining what I saw. So yeah, I guess that would be a form of journalism, and without the purest form of journalism. But it wasn't really top of my mind, and not what I was kind of processing in the moment.
Did you get the bullet out of your wall yet?
We had the bullet. The police came and took the bullet. We had it for a few days though, and lots of pictures were taken.
You asked though how. You asked though, how do you know who to trust? And in the middle of the night, the only thing that people were tweeting about was about Watertown across the country. Anyone on my Twitter feed was only about Watertown. And I saw Andrew's, I didn't know his first name then, but his tweets come in with pictures of the shootout. And, so we immediately get on the phone. The poor guy, I'm sure your phone was, we wanted people to call someone who we knew was an eyewitness. I mean, you could tell from, twit pics and videos who was right there, unless they were carrying on some enormous ruse. But, so I think that that night you could tell who was witnessing this. We badgered them.
You'd also get tips too, like I'm friends with Garrett Quinn, and he would say, I know this guy, and so, well, if Garrett knows this guy, he's legit, he's from Watertown, then this was the unalgorithmic way of adding my Twitter list.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to questions, if anybody has some. So I would just ask you, as I said, to stand up and identify yourself when you ask the question. And I think we need to use the microphone, or we don't? We don't need to use the microphone. So just project. You, sir.
My name is Matt Robert. I'm a freelance journalist. I normally do a lot of streaming work for the Sagas Advocate in Revere, and I've actually done some stuff for Wicked Local with Wes Roxbury and the Alston Writing Tab. And I followed both on the day of the marathon when I was actually alerted by my sister by text. I followed on Twitter that day and on Friday. I I actually heard about the MIT shooting right as I was coming home, and went to bed because I thought it was either another hoax like the one a few weeks before, or it was something unrelated. And so, but the thing that struck me, because I was on Twitter, and so I had access to Google and other things like that, that people in the field wouldn't necessarily have had, was that, and it's ROBARE, was that it seems that there have been this kind of thing with the breaking news. It's happened a lot before. I was particularly struck by the similarities with the Olympic Park bombing in 1996 at Atlanta, and how within a couple days, a lot of the same mistakes were made, a lot of the same problems developed, and so I guess my question is, we have as journalists, we have a lot of experience with breaking news and with the mistakes that go along with that, but it doesn't seem that the mistakes that we've made in the past are really corrected as we go along in the future. And I was just wondering how we would correct for that, how we would take that into account.
Cheryl, that seems like a tailor-made question for you.
It's interesting that you said that, because during Sandy Hook, it was the same type of thing. There was the wrong name, it was the wrong person. There's a lot of misinformation. Having been a reporter, there's so much pressure, especially if you do have sources, to come up with information. And even sources that you consider really reliable and have been really great to you will give you information that turns out to be not true. So during these kinds of situations, they're so emotional and they're so charged, you really have to be super careful, even with people that you've trusted for a very long time. And I think that's why the Boston police became so valuable, because you knew you could definitely rely on us. So if all else failed and you weren't comfortable with whatever your sources were saying, you had some information you could report that you knew to be true.
I'm just wondering if the other panelists, is there something substantively different about this event, or is it just the same, as the question sort of implies? Is it the same problem, just accelerated?
Well, I think one of the things that was so fascinating that you saw here was that I would agree that there were some lessons that just clearly weren't learned. Like, it doesn't matter if you're first by 30 seconds to anyone except you and the person in the other newsroom.
Right.
But if you're wrong by 30 seconds, everyone's going to remember that. So no one, remembers who reported first that the suspects were, that Watertown was related to the marathon, or that Tamerlan was dead, or that Sean Collier was dead, or anything. But we all remember that the New York Post, just day after day, printed bad stuff. We all remember that CNN, John King said, I have an CNN exclusive is confirming that there was unrest in this case. And I do think that as journalists, we still get overly caught up in, beating the competition by 30 seconds, and we end up tripping over ourselves when we do that.
I would really agree with that I thought one thing I did learn from this, in the end, I think all the talk of social media, it was the fundamentals of journalism that served people best, served news organizations best. I think that to the degree the Globe or any other news organization did a good job, it's because they relied on, talented reporters who were well-sourced, who knew the community, who got facts and reported them. But in terms of learning from the past, I think we had seen Newtown unfold, and there was misinformation put out there, and I think there was extreme caution. All along, there were pitfalls every day that, were there unexploded bombs out there? If there were 5, there were 10, and there was this sort of rigorous review every time, because you don't want to get the wrong information out there. One thing I would say, though, I mean, and Cheryl, we as news organizations develop good sources, and there are some sources who never lead you astray. And in the end, though, it's all a human network. And I think there are some news organizations, I think we can agree, were more reckless than others. I do think there have been some lessons learned, and in the end, there is, if one person along the way makes an assumption they shouldn't, things can go astray.
I was going to say, I would say there were some errors, but I have to say that I really think that the restraint was in place for the journalists. Remember, we're talking about the overarching umbrella of media and how much media was in play with giving out information. And everybody was not in the subset of journalists asking the question, who said it? Where did I get it from? Do I have a source? Do I have two sources? This is really important. And so that's why something like a keeper or other kinds of algorithms that can lead you to who the credible sources are very, very important. And I don't think people always understand that to be. So that's why when there were mistakes made by credible institutions in this case, it was really devastating on a level, because those are the places I expect to be right, I expect to know, I expect to have double, triple sourced information. So when that my little tectonic plate shifted under that, then it gives you pause. I think that's what may have happened here.
Jen and I both worked for one of those organizations that drilled in our heads that it's better to be the first place right with the story rather than being first with the story and being wrong. And to me, maybe the scariest thing about this, even in comparison to the Richard Jewell case or others, is we've come to rely upon one organization as sort of the central nervous system for journalism, the organization that got the 2000 election right, the organization that we won't call an election unless AP does. And when the place where we used to work makes a mistake, it's magnified too, because of that culture, and a place that's under such financial pressure as many other places. The scariest question for me on this, and maybe why we need other tools and other alternatives, is what will we do when we don't have the AP to hold our hand?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I can interject another Twitter question here, because it's related. The question is, should journalists communicate with their audiences about participating? I think what is arguably different about this story is that it happened visibly. The reporting happened visibly. The journalism happened visibly. And ordinary people were taking part in it, like Andrew. Lots of different stakeholders were playing roles. To what extent, and I think this is where this question is going, to what extent is it incumbent upon us as journalists to explain to non-journalists what we're doing, to explain the best practice that we use, the ethics that we use to establish these facts?
Well, or even just to use those best practices. I mean, imagine if John King, instead of saying, instead of that needing to be CNN exclusive, we're the first person to have this, imagine if he had come out and said, this is a rapidly evolving situation. I have one source in law enforcement who has told me this. However, these other places are not confirming this. We probably won't know what is actually going on for a little while, but that here is this information that's coming out here. He did that after the fact. First, it was a CNN exclusive, and then they started to dial it back after it was a CNN exclusive. And by that point, other news organizations had also started to follow them. So, I think if we followed some of our best practices, I mean, one of the things that's happening with Twitter is the whole process of what we do is being demystified. So it's not suddenly like, now it's much easier to see that we don't have some secret journalistic mind control that allows us to get people to talk to us. We're just out there talking to people, and or we're people who happen to be there at the right time. And I think that one way we can increase our credibility as journalists is to become more transparent about how we're getting information, where the information is coming from, why we think it's valuable. And I think that
or not
valuable, right? Exactly. And I think the The reasons why we haven't done that is because of some fear that if we sort of reveal what's behind the curtain, it won't seem as valuable. But I feel like we're kind of beyond that. Our work is already being devalued, and we should do whatever we can to make people realize where we are adding something that can't be replicated.
I think as far as I'm concerned, there were only 2 exclusives in this whole play. One by the Globe, Eric Moskovitz with the carjack guy, and the other, Ed Harding, got the boat guy. That's it. Everything else was well-reported, good information, when it was, in most instances. But exclusive? I mean, where nobody else had it? Where your people who knew?
I think the
That's it.
102 hours piece was
yeah.
what an old boss of mine used to call a scoop of analysis. And
Yeah,
that's-
okay. I'll give you that.
And a scoop of like just sheer brunt force reporting. And that's something where the Globe has. I'm proud to live in Boston and proud to say the Globe is my newspaper over these last couple of weeks. And that's the type of thing that the 102 hours report is the type of thing where no one is going to care if they beat the Herald by 10 minutes on the arrest or anything. That's something that people are going to look to for a long time.
Okay. Brett, I thought you had your hand up.
Oh, I did. Should I stand up? I'm Brett.
Please.
I'm a Nieman Fellow. I forgot my tuxedo. I have a question for Seth. One of the interesting things I think about what you did that night is you're a professional journalist with a lot of experience, but you weren't on assignment, as you mentioned. And it's possible to imagine like other journalists with similar experience being able to influence and do good work in a story like this without being on assignment, sort of like citizen journalism. And I wondered if you had any credentialing issues, if anyone asked you who you were and what you said. And I'm also curious as to how you sold this to your wife.
So I did not have any credentialing issues, but mainly that was because I was I literally arrived as the police were arriving. And so by the time, initially when the police set up a perimeter, I was inside the perimeter. So I didn't have any credentialing issues. One interesting thing related to that is at some point in the middle of the night, someone asked me, who is paying for this to me? And I said, no one. And so I ended up selling a piece to the New Yorker, but it made me realize that actually I found the process of live tweet reporting that, incredibly fulfilling, and that's something that no one is ever going to get any remuneration for. So I did not. The only time when the credentialing was a problem was when I was trying to pick something up in the Arsenal parking lot or the Watertown Mall parking lot, which by that point looked like a political convention with like hundreds of satellite trucks, and I was they let me in, but I sort of half wished that they had not let me in there because that was not where I wanted to be.
And how did you sell it to your?
How did I sell it to my wife?
Did you say I'm going to go chase some cops?
Yeah. She was tired. It was 11-ish, and. I had a harder time, like ABC started calling my parents at 3 a.m. They were asleep. And I had a harder time explaining to them at 3 a.m. what I was doing.
What are you doing out so late, Seth? Betsy, you had a question, and there's a gentleman here.
Yeah, I'm Betsy O'Donovan. I'm a Nieman Fellow. I'm a Community Journalism Fellow. And Andrew Kitzenberg, I was very interested in what you said about not being a journalist, particularly since we're talking about transparency and making those tools available to people. I just noticed you have 29,272 Twitter followers. So you have a platform and you shot photos. Why do you say you're not a journalist? That's what I want.
So the question is, why is Andrew not a journalist, given what he's done covering this story?
I was saying earlier that I'm not a journalist by education or by any previous experience. And I still, I guess, don't consider myself a journalist, although the past, week and a half has kind of put me forward as a journalist, as a citizen journalist. Nothing that I was expecting, wanting, or trying to be. It was wrong place, right time. And so I do realize I have this platform now, and actually I realized that shortly after that Twitter following kind of moved from about 50 people to 1,000 people to 10,000 people to 20,000 people, all within about a few hours. And so at that point, I understand, I watch the news, I read the news, I understand the responsibilities. I didn't anticipate that those responsibilities were expected of me, but I did my best to not fabricate anything or not make up anything that I didn't see. So, in those few hours of chaos within my home, I did try to tell my story and give the information that I was seeing in as true a form as possible.
This gentleman here, and I also saw a hand in the corner. And Borja. Go ahead, sir.
Tom McGuire. Did the media at the time, or even since, sufficiently question the unprecedented decision to lock down an entire city, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars, which took away the freedom temporarily of over 1 million people? That decision was made by the state with no type of democratic input. And it seems to be an overreaction that was fed by the saturation coverage of the media that tended to blow it out of proportion. And I'm wondering whether the expense of that was worth the actual result that came from it.
It definitely was not hundreds of millions of dollars.
Okay,
it was $338,000. So it's a perfectly fine topic to debate, but it absolutely was nowhere near hundreds of millions of dollars.
Fact checking is important. So there's two questions in there. I think, Cheryl, you can answer the first question about the lockdown, but there's a broader question for us as journalists. This is a huge story, obviously, but should it have been the only story, and should it have been nonstop coverage? Sure.
I don't know that it would have been the only story, but it certainly was the biggest story that Boston has seen, or the country has seen, since September 11th. So in that way, it was huge, and in a different way from September 11th, where, and I reported during September 11th, where we expected to find victims, and there were no victims. Everyone disintegrated. In this case, you had victims that were alive and remained. And so that was horrific. And this was during an event that has gone on for, 117 years, and has always been a family event, and has always been an event where, it's been celebratory in the city. So for something like this to happen, and for the horror of that, and for it to have gone on for the rest of the week, where no one knew where these guys were or who they were and how were we going to find them and were they planning other attacks. I think it was a time of real uncertainty in the city, and I think it warranted the coverage that it got, for sure.
I have to say, we discussed it all the time. It was a thread from the beginning. And in those calls that were coming in with people asking questions, that was something. The majority of people felt they were happy that the order had been put out there by Governor Patrick. It was often compared to his shutting down the city for the blizzard, by the way. So in the whole context of what does this mean that we're suddenly a city where our governor has shut us down a few times. But a lot of people felt very comfortable. There were those others who did not, but it was expressed and been talked about quite a bit and continues to be.
And for sure, we asked the questions. Yeah. I mean, from the moment we hear the MPTA shut down at 6 a.m. in the morning, it's, we know why, that they are, obviously they want to contain the suspect, but really, is this necessary? You're bringing commerce to an end. I mean, I don't know that we got the answers that, Cheryl has given and others. I mean, I think people were terrified and they didn't know where this guy was and he had bombs, but we were asking the questions, it didn't, we didn't change any decisions, but.
I just wonder where, Seth, you got that $338,000 figure from, because that sounds really
Yeah, they just assessed it.
small.
No,
I mean,
Bloomberg did an analysis of it and said that the cost to the city was $338,000. That might not. I
sounds
assume that
low
doesn't
for a commerce, including
right,
stop
right,
throughout
plus
the entire city.
But that was their.
It was a decision of grave consequence.
Sure.
That,
I'm not saying it shouldn't be examined.
And as my colleagues did, we put that question out. I mean, it's not like we just said,
great.
And it's ongoing. It's a discussion that's ongoing.
We also had to report it. It was, it was a huge decision that was going to affect everyone in the city, but we did ask
Okay.
some questions.
I think I saw a hand back here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Lisa Mullins, journalist and former Nieman Fellow. I had a question about
You could
actually.
speak up a little bit.
Sure. Cheryl, maybe you can take this. I was just wondering in terms of the shelf life of a fact that turned out to be wrong, and that was the commissioner, I believe, I can't remember what time he said it, but saying that there was a third either incident or explosion that had happened at the JFK library. After that was said, I'm sure a gazillion reporters went screaming to the library right away, and it turned out that it was some unrelated fire, maybe you can describe what it was. Did you have to tweet that when he said it? And I know there's an explanation later on, but do you know if that was retweeted and when it eventually was corrected and then died a happy death?
So the question is about the fire at JFK Library and the process of tweeting that information and tweeting the information that it's not related to the bombings.
This is when I think for us in the police department, I felt like we were reporters and it was breaking news information, and we were getting information, and it had happened so soon after the other two explosions had gone off. So that's why it was thought to be related. And the type of fire that it was extremely hot. It actually melted the metal in the doorway. So that's why it was thought to be much more than just an average fire that would be unrelated. So I think at that time, we were, including the police department, we're connecting the dots. And as soon as we realized that that wasn't the case, we put out information that said that the fire did not look like it was related, that it looked like it was a fire, an unrelated fire. As to how that got retweeted, honestly, it died very quickly. As soon as it got tweeted and people thought it was something, it hung around for a little bit. As soon as we put out the correct information, it went away. Some other things, not so much. They lived a little longer, some other stories. But
Okay, we just have about 10...
I just need to correct that. Because...
live fact-checking, ladies and gentlemen.
If I said 338,000, what I meant was 333 million.
And what...
Stand corrected.
Is your source the Boston Police Department?
Well, this is a multiple different... it's analysis by Bloomberg Business Week that then a bunch of different sources seem to basically agree with.
Good enough for us. Okay, this right here, and then the gentleman in the back, and Josh. And we just have a few minutes left, so I would ask you to be brief with your questions, and also the panelists to be brief with their answers.
So my name is Christina Cosnese. I'm a longtime freelancer for Globe. I know Dave. I worked for Dave and John Peter. I covered Watertown for the Bill for many years, not during this incident per se. But my question was really about, so obviously maybe today is too soon to get to this point, but I'm curious editorially, have we turned over every rock yet? I mean, how are you making decisions about who's going to be worth talking to and interviewing and reporting on? The guy that delivers the Chinese food to the roommates who just got arrested, or how are you making decisions about now going forward? What needs to be reported? What's worth reporting? What is just sort of flotsam related to the story?
Do you want to take that, Jen, and David as well?
Sure. I mean, I think we're still in the throwing everything at it that we can. I mean, not quite to the degree that we were in the first 2 weeks, but I still feel like we're a little bit in reaction mode. We were not. I don't think there's going to be a time when we're going to see something erupt on Twitter and we'll be like, don't care about it. I mean, and during the first 2 weeks, we were reacting to the news, but also engaging in enterprise such as the weekend piece that Seth mentioned. I mean, I think, not to disclose too much of our playbook, but I think a lot going forward too is going to focus on the victims and the people and the city recovering. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of people we want to look at over time. And the investigation, I think, especially what's happening in DC with some of the security questions, will remain a focus of, a lot of reporting. I still feel like I'm still a little bit too much into it to know how it plays out, except I do know, we need to pay attention to the victims and people who are going to be living with the after effects of this for a long time.
I'll answer that a different way for these types of
David, could you use the microphone?
For these types of stories in the future, we sought to hit readers on 4 different levels, I think. with that little grid you saw, it was like voices from the ground that we had sort of verified. With a live blog, they were small reports and feeds from reporters, or that we have. It could be as short as one paragraph and a picture, a paragraph in a video, or 300 words or 400 words, a good germ of a story. After that would be what you would, in journalism, you might call your main story or your main bar, that is continually updated. And so, it's sort of a duty for people on social media to say, out that this is our main, if you want the context, here it is, and we've updated with higher counts of the wounded, or we've the capture of the remaining suspect, or this person is still alive, or various things like that, so that you can get that big contextual read. And the fourth thing, which Jen also mentioned, is that other crew that's even digging deeper to find this piece of enterprise, or this story that maybe nobody else has. Maybe Jen possibly could have an excellent Russian speaker on her staff that could round out the story about the brothers. And or we might have, the new we, at the Washington Post, may have really good sources in the Justice Department or in other places where we could get certain things that maybe the Globe couldn't get. So each place tries to find their advantages on that sort of fourth level. But it's complicated because 20 years ago, there were one or two levels. Now there are at least four.
The gentleman, yes, Joe.
I'm Joe Bauer. I'm on the faculty in Southern Nieman Fellow. I'm kind of interested in the story of the scale of what happened Thursday night was kind of astonishing, and this sort of, I heard it because I live in sort of on the west, and it seemed like almost a self-organizing police effort. And then you have what then goes into the lockdown, and it's really kind of interesting. I had some students point out to me that there are 4 countries in the world where 10 times as many people get killed for this kind of thing, roughly daily. So there is an interesting question, which is if we think that this kind of thing can be happening more often, we might want to look at how did we deal with it? How did we get organized to deal with it? Because we didn't, I don't understand how there were thousands of police. Has the number ever been reported how many police were actually on the scene? So there's a lot, there's an interesting question, because if this is going to happen again, and it probably will, how do we deal with it? How should we think about it?
So just to summarize the question, it's given the complexity of this event from both a journalistic point of view, but also a public law enforcement point of view, it seemed like a self-organizing system. I think that's really interesting to explore in the context of social media, which in many ways evolves organically. And so I guess we get Cheryl, your point of view from the public law enforcement's point of view, and I'd be interested to hear the journalistic perspective on integrating social media into what we do.
In this case, it was really interesting how quickly the resources were marshaled, and it just took a few phone calls to key people to get the federal government involved, to get the state police involved, to get all the resources that needed to get there. So I don't know that we've come up with an accurate number at this point. I know it's all just part of a post-mortem that everyone's doing on this to determine what worked, what didn't work, what would we need to do if something like this should ever happen again. And are there better ways to put things in place so that we can move quickly or better or organize easier? I think it's still evolving. It's still not nailed down, I don't think.
Any of the journalists want to address the integration of social media into what we do?
First thing I'd say, maybe speaking for Jen also, is we'd be very curious as to what the law enforcement checklist would be, and without being brought in too much to be corrupted, that would be very useful to know for us the next time around too, is the decision tree for ratcheting it up. I mean, there there was legit, it's 2 or 3 in the morning and you're deciding what to do. We should shut down the MBTA, and it escalates very quickly. I was retweeting MIT, no classes, Harvard, no classes, and then boom, city out. So, just so that we know.
I mean, it was a very thoughtful discussion, and it wasn't made lightly. I mean, it was something that everybody weighed in on, and the governor, and it wasn't a decision that somebody just said, oh, we need to shut everything down until we find, this guy. That wasn't the case. And I think it was a balance that you had to determine whether or not, how big was the public safety risk, and what is the balance of commerce and keeping people home. But then the other part of it is, I think we saw a couple of tweets that said, that we're going to lift the shelter-in-place rule, and people are like, yeah, like I'm going anywhere. They were afraid. I mean, people didn't want to go anywhere. So there was that as well.
Okay, we have a question from Josh, and Yakov has a question, and I think that's all the time we have for questions. Go ahead, Josh.
Josh Benton from Nieman Lab. One of the tensions that social media has brought to newsrooms is that institutions used to have the publishing power, and now that power has devolved down to individual reporters, individual staffers. That's been a source of a lot of tension over the years within the last few years in newsrooms. And I'm curious, for those of you who work in newsrooms, whether the experience of going through this has shifted your thoughts on that. On one hand, you had individual reporters who were providing important reporting from the scene, but who were also operating without an editorial net. You also had institutional accounts that were having to make decisions about when something rose to the level of having a Boston Globe label attached to it on Twitter. I'm just curious if anything happened in this event to shift your thinking in either direction.
I mean, I think, Twitter, I feel like, I think it just, for us, this whole experience confirmed, I think, what we've sort of been seeing for the last 2 years, 3 years, since we've really begun to integrate Twitter into what we do, is that it's an incredibly good way to get information out to others. We do have rules and on what reporters can report. There were a lot of decisions that went into when can BostonGlobe.com or Boston.com retweet something that someone else is saying. Do we retweet CNN saying X? I come out of this experience, I think it's added a whole new level of competition. And it's hard. I never wanted to turn Twitter off. I was fascinated by what was going on out there, but it does add this whole sort of level of angst because you see all your competitors out there. It does make it more transparent. It's not like I wonder what the Herald's working on across town. You pretty much know exactly what's going on. but I think in the end, there were certainly pitfalls, but I think it was an incredibly vibrant, interesting way to watch what was unfolding. And again, I rely a lot on my reporters. I was looking a lot at and we had a lot of reporters out there, and a lot of my Twitter feed is coming from my own people. But I think and we put it all into a live blog, and I think it really, I was looking at it today, it's just very vibrant, real-time unfolding of what happened over those 5 days. And I'm a traditional journalist in a lot of ways, but I come out of this feeling like Twitter has given us a really sort of valuable new tool, if used properly.
Just to answer Josh, really, I'll be very, very brief. From a guy who's been frustrated that we don't have the massive armies of paper boys and girls anymore, that the production or promotion departments of what we had never was sufficient, or marketing never enough to really kind of show the dynamism of the editorial side when we want to try something new. I'm absolutely delighted that there's a broader base for every one of the people who had a broader base to distribute what's important to a broader group of people who have determined that these people are trustworthy news sources. Because, all of a sudden we've got a bunch of new paper boys. And we are reversing the clock a little bit and distributing what we think is important.
If I could just say, I think it was a both and, that while people were on the ground and individually saying what they saw, there was a lot more discussion, though, about what certain things should be said and what if there were other issues going on. Well, before we put that, let's have a conversation. So there was a both and going on at the same time. I don't know if it was just because it was this particular incident, or if that's something that will continue on a daily basis.
Well, two very quick thoughts. One thing that I think we need to remember is that Twitter is still is nowhere near the mass medium that newspapers or television or anything else is. So when you're in the echo chamber of the Twitter's verse, it can feel very much like everyone in the world is participating in this conversation. You're hearing from people in Samoa, New Zealand, but in reality, you know, the number of people who are on Twitter is a subset of the population, and then the number of people who are using Twitter to access news and to get news is a subset of that subset of the population. And that's why, you know, the TV, the big three TV networks and the news, the 24-hour news shows, even though their influence is diminished, it's still much greater than any other medium out there, really. The other thing that in partial response to your question is that I certainly saw in the days afterwards is a lot of the people who started to be sources that people in Twitter would look for were, you know, ex-reporter at the Globe or ex-reporter at the Times, or so it does give opportunities to sort of democratize what's going on there. But still, I think even in that, in this very new, very evolving medium, people were looking for reporters and producers and photographers who were attached to some place that they already knew about.
And by the way, Mass Inc.'s poll that just came out, 72% of the people that they polled said television was their main source, just to add to that.
Okay, last question goes to Yakov here, but I would encourage everyone to remain afterwards and to engage the panelists with additional questions.
So my name is Yakov Katz. I'm a fellow here at the Nieman Foundation. So I understand the uncertainty and the possible or potential foreign policy ramifications that a terrorist attack could have in the homeland. But I was surprised by your comment, Cheryl, that this was the biggest story for the nation since 9/11, particularly considering that just a few months ago, 20 children and another 6 adults were killed in Newtown. And, you know, again, numbers don't always tell the story, but this was just the number of people killed here were just over 10% of the number killed in Connecticut. But with that said, my question then is, and this story took over everything, like there was nothing else going on in the news. So is there any accountability, and this isn't the question more to the journalists here, of whether, or thinking, did we not give too much to this story? Did we, was this maybe, I don't know, hysterical, I don't want to judge, but response here, did it not maybe play into what these people were ultimately after, and did it not also, is there a rethinking of maybe how to cover such a story like this in the future?
I just want to jump in on that. 3 people died, but one of the reasons why so few people died was because of the incredible response from people who were on the scene right away. So you need to understand that there were nearly 300 people who suffered all kinds of grievous wounds. And the reason many of those people survived was because there was a medical tent about 30 feet away. There were doctors all over the place, and there were police and there were first responders. So this was not just, I mean, Newtown was horrific, but there were 2 bombs placed in very crowded places, and a lot of people got seriously injured. And many of those people lived because people responded incredibly quickly. And they were fortunate to be downtown, close to hospitals, with ambulances and other staff. So I just want that context to be clear.
And I wanted to make a point as well. I mean, Newtown was horrific on a lot of different levels, but this was terrorism. Newtown was someone who was emotionally disturbed, who went in there with a gun and had a purpose and killed himself as part of that. So there was no ongoing threat. This is terrorism. This was planned event where these people made bombs and they brought them to somewhere where they planned to not only kill, but seriously injure people in a very big way and in a very public way. So yeah, I do think it's a bigger story than someone who's emotionally disturbed and has a gun and goes and does something that's terrible. But it's a different take on the story.
These 2 guys were emotionally disturbed. They were horrifically emotionally disturbed.
Wait, sorry, I just want to keep the conversation a little bit centralized here.
I will say that, today CNN released a poll saying that people are more worried about terrorism now than they were, and I sort of felt like, no shit. You just spent 2 weeks saying terror in the homeland every single day, and with flashing sirens and breaking news alerts. And so I think that we do need to be conscious of the fact that one of the goals traditionally of terrorism is to cause unrest in a society, and certainly we are not responding the way Great Britain did during the times of the Troubles, or Israel does now, which is essentially to go on and continue about your life. So I think that's a legitimate question, certainly. I do think that it's a different, one of the things that makes it a big story is because we have not, depending on how you classify Fort Hood, had a terrorist attack in the United States since 9/11. And if you had said that on September 12th, 2001, that we're not going to have a terrorist attack for the next decade plus, I don't think anyone would have believed you. I think everyone would have thought that was the new normal. So one of the things this has done is reawaken that anxiety that this is the new normal. I think a really good story that is actually the story I was working on before Watertown happened is whether this is actually a big risk. Whether we should be afraid of something like this happening, whether how easy is it to pull something like this off. And I'm sure someone will do that story. I think that's a good story. But there's certainly I think the scale of the coverage is certainly a legitimate question. But I definitely understand why it has gotten so much the attention that it has.
Okay, just to conclude, I would like to ask all of the panelists just to answer very briefly or reflect very briefly. We're now more or less 2 weeks out from the event. What have you learned professionally from what happened? What would you do differently the next time a similar situation happened? And to come back to Ann Marie's question from the introduction, are we, as journalists, as an industry, as a society, better off for how this event was covered? And we'll just go around the horn, starting with you, Jen.
I don't know if I can answer all three questions in one, but I really feel what came out of this for me was that regardless of what's going on in the digital realm and with Twitter, social media, et cetera, it's really about the fundamentals. It's about, we've had our cutbacks at the Globe. We still had enough people to cover this both in a daily way and to pursue enterprise. And, we've had people who have, a publisher and for now an owner who has been willing to invest in the newsroom. Through all of this, I think that's what served us best, having people at the hospitals, having people at the scenes, using the new tools. But, in terms of what I would do differently, there are certainly decisions here and there that I would, second guess. But, I think by and large, we tried to stay true to our principles and engage readers and viewers in every way we could.
I would just say for me, what this experience at least reinforces is the need for a vital major metropolitan newspaper like the Boston Globe that could cull through the many, many different voices and clear a place in the smoke of a very chaotic scene exactly what's happening and be a source of understanding and truth. And for me, this has also reinforced just how amazing some of my colleagues are.
I can't stress enough, we keep talking about it, but we saw it in action here, the importance of having journalists connected to the community, who know the streets, who know the people, who can cull the voices, who know the streets of Watertown. That was really important, to the point that people just almost stopped watching here in Boston National and concentrated on what local news services provided them. So I think that is fabulous. I think the lesson that we can all learn is that even for those of us who have great stock in those who are the most credible sources, that we have to remember that because there is human error, that the most credible sources are most credible most of the time. And that we also have to know that there are some times where they just won't be for a variety of circumstances.
What have I learned? Summing it up in a sentence or two is a tough one. I'm not exactly sure. I think it'll probably take me a while to realize that. I definitely think of Twitter as an active reporting tool in a much different way, as opposed to the way I had thought of it, which was to identify sources or to connect with experts or establish relationships. And I'm not even talking about what I did, but what Andrew did, what people on the ground were doing, and how that was augmenting what else was going on. I also learned actually how inefficient television is. Just because I could see, so I would be there experiencing something, and then I could see a television reporter then call something in, and then would see, oh, I just saw this on CNN, and it was like a 8-year-old's game of telephone, where you would get one word wrong, and it would completely change the context of everything. But then this information was going out. What would I do differently? There were a couple of times especially during that day, where I was kind of snarky and mainly about other reporters, and I regret that. And I regretted it almost immediately and said that I regretted it almost immediately. But there was one time where I was standing next to a reporter who was describing the overwhelming smell of smoke, and there was absolutely no smell of smoke there. And so I wrote that, and then almost as soon as I did, I realized that I have no idea what the person on the other end of the phone is asking. She might have, or he might have been asking, when you first arrived in Watertown, what was going on? Or so I regret that. And the Are We Better Off thing, I don't want this to turn into a Globe love fest, but
you go ahead.
I think one thing that's been really striking in this is how absent the Herald has been from this conversation. And it's not because there are bad reporters there, and it's not because they don't do their job. It's because they've been decimated in terms of staffing, and they don't have a Metro staff that can go out and cover this in the way that the Globe did. And for people who value that type of information, subscribe to a newspaper or subscribe to a magazine, and because that's the only way that we're going to be able to keep on staffing these. The fact that you could have whatever, a dozen or 14 Metro reporters who were down there, within an hour and reporting on it, that's expensive. Having that type of staff is expensive. We've been really lucky in this city. There are a lot of cities that don't have that type of presence anymore. And I shudder to think what the coverage would have been like had there not been a really robust Metro newspaper in this city.
Yeah. What have I think I've learned that it's easier to have responsibilities than to be responsible. And I think that as a police department, you have to be the voice in a major crisis. And I think that we did that, even though I didn't know that we were doing it at the time. So I think I learned that. And I think that we have a responsibility to inform the public about what's going on in a timely way and to be as transparent as we can without jeopardizing public safety or a police officer's safety, and to get the information out timely. So I think in that way, I think we did a good job on social media. I think some of the other ways, because we only have an office with 4 people in it, getting hundreds of requests from all over the world and dealing with all of the things that this small little group of people dealt with, it was pretty remarkable. But in hindsight, we probably could have done better if we had more resources, but that wasn't possible. So that's what I would say.
Just 3 basics. Have a coverage plan. Antenna up for new tools and sources. And number 3, verify, verify, verify. If I just real quick, the new tools and sources include something as simple and wonderful as Boston.com's Google Doc, where everybody opened their hearts and their homes and their couches and their futons to the people who couldn't get out of town afterward, and the 10,000 people that wrote on that. And I had a little Bitly link that had 20,000 people who read it, and a simple sheet, a simple document showed so much about the humanity of the town, and we shouldn't discard it just because it doesn't have a 10-paragraph format.
Well, this is clearly a conversation that is going to continue for some time, and I'm really glad that we could get a start on it here tonight. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us online and all of you here in the room, and I'd like you all to thank our participants, both up here and in the audience. Thanks very much.